Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. I'm Todd Langman. In this series, the Rights Track is on the road, capturing the voices, experiences, and knowledge of people around the world who are part of the global coalition to end modern slavery by 2030. In today's episode, we're talking about fast fashion and football. Our guest is Baroness Lola Young, a crossbench peer in the House of Lords who is active in the area of ethical fashion and is working to amend the UK's Modern Slavery Act. She's also Honorary Rights Lab Professor of Anti-Slavery Policy and Business here at the University of Nottingham. I started by asking her what drew her to the issue of modern slavery in the world of fashion.
I think for me, I've always been interested in working in one way or another in different parts of the cultural and creative industries. And actually, initially, I hadn't worked in fashion, but worked in other, like film, photography, and a lot of visual arts. And I'd been interested in clothing and fashion, but not that deeply involved in the actual business. And then when I was in the House of Lords, I was looking for an area on which I could focus that other people weren't necessarily looking at. And somebody suggested to me, well, why don't you look at ethical fashion? So I said, oh, that sounds interesting. And I began to think then how deficient my knowledge was of the area, how, although I would be quite scrupulous when I was buying food, I would, of course, pay attention if a particular company had, been found out for having children working in the supply chains and all the rest of it. But I didn't really know, it was not really formed, my knowledge. So it was as a result of talking with lots of people in the industry who were concerned and very, very knowledgeable. And they said, why don't you do something in Parliament on this? Because we need politicians to sit up and take notice of what's happening.
It's interesting because people were okay with free-range eggs. They were willing to pay a little bit extra for a free-range egg. They like free-range pigs. Vegetarians have been very effective at mobilizing public opinion and industry changing standards around food production, as well as switching quite a large part of the population to a vegetarian diet, partly based on an environmental claim as well as a health claim. And we've seen other industries, certainly the vegetarians have also got people to switch from wearing leather shoes to
and certainly fur has been out forever, hasn't it? So yes.
So what does the modern slavery movement need to do to raise that public awareness in a way that, asking people, do you know where your clothes come from, is a very simple question, but a lot of people have no idea where their clothes come from.
Of course not. And I mean, partly it's a problem of education in its broadest sense. But if we go back to 2013 and the Rana Plaza disaster, I think a lot of people did become aware of what was going on. Okay, it wasn't labelled modern slavery as such because that was all about a building collapsing. But actually, some of the features of production in that building, which led to its collapse, are directly attributable to this desire for fast throwaway fashion. So I think more people are aware, but we've still got a lot to do on that score. For me, it's important that people understand that they're always making choices when they buy things, no matter how little money they've got. So then it's a question of how can you make sure that you spend as wisely as possible. I think the other thing to say, where I find there's still a lot of misunderstanding about what we can do to make this whole situation better, because fundamentally we need to stop thinking of clothes as these throwaway items, these cheap throwaway items. Having said that, it's also the case that a lot of those factories where you'll find, a cheap, low-cost, fast fashion brand will also be making clothes for one of the high-end designers.
Let me push you on that, because if somebody wants to buy a high-end bag, a Gucci bag or a Coach bag or something that is highly desirable, and yet they think that might be okay because they're paying so much for it. Are goods like that equally susceptible to the problem?
Well, those particular brands I couldn't say, but I would say, but at the high end of fashion, you will find, as I say, that they're being made in the same factories as the low end of fashion. Now, you can't tell me that because you're being charged, let's say, £80 for a T-shirt, if it's being made in the same factory that will charge you £3 for a T-shirt, is that higher price brand paying more to the people in that factory? No, of course not. So what it is you might get a better quality cotton in that T-shirt. But essentially, it's the same people making that as making the cheap stuff. So what difference is there? Well, basically you're being scammed into paying a lot more because you're paying for the brand and not just the garment. So I think that this is one of the issues around fashion that is different to food, you see, Todd, because with food, yes, there is a certain amount of status tied up in it. So, if you present food in a particular way and you can go to some swanky delicatessen and buy expensive cheese and all the rest of it, there is that. But with clothing, it's that times 1,000. We live our identities through what we wear to some extent, to a great extent, especially for young people, that's true.
Well, it's a way of signaling, right?
Yeah,
so
totally.
Kids' identity signaling, they're also building networks about like-minded fashion.
Yeah, exactly. So we know you. It's very interesting because I just read this article a little while ago, this week, about a dress that was on sale in Zara, white background and black spots, I think it is. And it just shows you the dilemma that the people who follow fashion have in a way. So this dress has apparently become so popular that every other young woman is wearing it, and then they don't want to wear it because every other young woman is wearing it, but they want to be seen to be in the groove that knows you should be wearing that dress.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So you're caught between the things. You want to be like everybody else, but you don't want to be like everybody else. So what's happened is that women have started to customize. So they've started to dye it, or cut the sleeves shorter, or cut the skirt shorter, or put some embellishment on it, etc., which I think is a great thing, because then it is much more individual. But the point is also that everybody buying that dress, if that dress sells out, and Zara then think, we must have 10,000 more of these dresses, they've got to go and hassle some factory somewhere, whether that's here or overseas, to produce very quickly, to catch on to this trend, another 10,000 white dresses with black spots on.
So it's almost like real-time delivery or just-in-time delivery of fashion.
That is what fast fashion is about. Yeah. I mean, it really is. And I mean, if you go to some of these online fashion retailers, you can see, a garment comes in, it's photographed, and then it's up on the website. And before you know it, it's there. And so if you're into that trend, you're trend watching, and that is really fashionable that week, and then next week there'll be another batch of clothing in. So that this is the heart of the problem of fast fashion, particularly in relation to the environment, but also in relation to forced labour, because people have to work overtime in order to produce that stuff.
Quantity and quantity on time.
Exactly.
And that time window has advanced considerably.
It absolutely.
You don't even have seasonal fashion anymore. There was like four seasons. No. And I always bought out of season because that's when it was cheap, right? Because you get the big percentage discount.
You have like 4 or 5 sales a year now, because you've got new stock coming in every day in some
Zara's
shops.
producing stuff very quickly.
Well, Zara really pioneered this fast fashion model, because it was like, you saw your favourite actor on the screen or model wearing something, and you wanted something that looked like that more or less straight away. And so Zara led, and others followed in that same kind of theme. And it's very difficult now, because this is so habitual that people don't know how to get out of this cycle, this loop. The other thing that happens is, let's say, you want 10,000 extra dresses, and that factory hasn't got the capacity to do it. So what do? They subcontract it. So therefore, if you're the person who's commissioned these extra 10,000 dresses, you don't even know where half of them are being made.
But you have responsibility for that, right? Under the Modern Slavery Act, you would do, right?
Well, kind of, yeah. It's one of those areas where the Act isn't too specific, because it doesn't actually, I don't think it actually says you should only look at tier 1 suppliers. But when you look at the modern slavery statements, you can see that some companies think that that's all they need to do. They don't need to look too deep.
But in principle, Article 50 or Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act would cover that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the best practice would be to go as far down your supply chain as you could.
Yes.
Then you've got to think, I do have some sympathy, because one company that I was talking to said, well, we use 10,000 different suppliers.
Right.
And if you think, moving away from fashion, if you think about cars, I think I read that there's something like 60,000 different parts in a car, and they might all be being produced by different manufacturers. So it is very hard. But again, my argument is you've created this mess, this business model. Now you've got to create something that replaces it and doesn't damage people or the environment.
But in a way, supply created its own demand.
Absolutely.
And so I was trying to work out the sort of false economy argument behind consumers buying something for so little that lasts it doesn't last very long. I guess the rational calculation is it's only £1, and if it breaks tomorrow, I don't care.
Exactly so.
Right?
I've heard people say this. I mean, I've been on a bus where a woman's come in laden with bags of clothing from Primark in this particular instance, and her friend said to her, "Wow, you've really spent out there." And she said, "Yeah, how did you have time to try all of that?" "Oh no, I didn't bother to try it all on because what doesn't fit I'll just throw away."
Wow.
Really? I mean, that is terrible. So we shouldn't be feeding into this kind of sensibility. The other thing about it is, if you've got relatively decent clothes and you give them to a charity shop, they can sell them on.
Yeah.
If you take a pair of trousers that only cost you £10, how much is the charity shop going to get for it if they end up with it? I mean, no. So it goes into landfill.
Yeah.
So, you think you're salving your conscience by giving it away, and in fact, you're just making the problem even worse.
So from a position in the House of Lords, how can you make a difference?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I feel that we have great convening power in the House of Lords. So by and large, if I say to an organisation or a company, I'd really like to see you to speak about this, they will come. And in fact, some approached me before I even approached them. They said, "Oh, we hear you're interested in this. Can we tell you about what we're trying to do?" And so you build up a rapport, you build up a relationship with the companies and try and work with them to improve and to change and to address some of these really difficult issues and sort of to help them through that. So there's that convening power, which is very useful. It also means then I can go to government and say, well, I've had conversation with X number of fashion industries, extractive industries, construction or whatever, and this is what they're telling me, this is what we should be doing. How are you going to address this through government regulatory advice or policy making or legislation? Mm-hmm. So it is actually a great position to be in terms of being able to have access to people who have power and influence. It doesn't always work, of course, sadly, but there is that opportunity to try and make that difference.
And these cross-party groups, that's another way that you can do this, right? And there you would actually be able to have hearings and generate legislation.
Totally. I mean, if you work out how to use them well, they can be as effective, almost as effective as select committees, because you get people in, as you say, you get them to give evidence, you can question them, and then you can write the report, publish it, and get it seen. I also happen to think, as you will know, that it's important that whatever we say is based on evidence, and that's where obviously the Rights Lab and other organisations, that do proper, rigorous academic research is so important, because I think often, you'll hear people say, well, some people think this, or this is what some practice is, or anecdotally I've heard, and you want to say, well, excuse me, but, what's the evidence for you making that statement? And, so it's really, really important to have that base, I think.
So systematic evidence is really hard to collect, and we've been having long discussions on the rights track about this. Hard to find populations.
Yes.
The fundamental challenge of unobservability.
Yes.
These are deep philosophical questions and epistemological questions and methodological questions, which there are people out there trying to solve those problems. There's still a lot of work to be done, and we're finding that technology and science can help us in ways that we didn't know. Certainly the work with satellites, for example, at least identifies potential sites of slavery that were not yet identifiable. There are other things that be done from the science and technology side, certainly on big data, AI, machine learning, things like that hadn't really been designed to address the problem, may just be able to do that. So I wonder if we might just shift a little bit my questioning and your interest in sport, because I know you're a big fan of football, but also have a concern over sport, and I'd be curious if you're thinking about new work in this area, or you think there's new, quite interesting work in the area of modern slavery in sport.
There definitely is, and I think it's interesting to me for so many reasons, partly because, as you say, I really love quite a lot of sports, not all sports, but quite a lot. And my observation, like a year or so ago, even more recently than that, would be that in the business of sports, they haven't really fully realised the potential for thinking through a concept like human rights in order to address some of those big problems in their supply chains or in the way in which sports, which athletes are treated and so on and so forth. There's a really wide range of issues that come under that general umbrella of human rights, which would include equalities, discrimination, modern forms of slavery, trafficking in and through sport. And so, again, part of our role as the All Party Parliamentary Group is to try and find ways to support the sector to address to recognise and to address some of these issues. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things for me is that they don't come to these kind of broader meetings. You don't see them at any of the conferences that I've been to that looking at the implications of the Modern Slavery Act on business. You'll see people from construction, from cocoa, tea, from fashion, from extractive industries, etc., but you very rarely, in fact, I don't think I've ever come across sporting bodies in that.
But these are billion-pound businesses, right?
I know, particularly the Premier League. So how I first latched onto it was I had this thought, which was, well, wait a minute, every Premier League club has a turnover of more than 36 million, which is the threshold for reporting under the Modern Slavery Act. So let's have a look at their modern slavery statements. And to be honest with you, some of them were pitiful. Then some of them have improved, and we're gradually, I think, beginning to sort of demand more of them, and that they're kind of looking at how they can fulfill that demand. I think they're beginning to recognise that it's really important to take these things head on. I mean, working with, for example, the British Retail Consortium. So it's all the big name shops and everything. And there they are launching a report which details how they can contribute to fulfilling Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 on, fair and dignified employment, no exploitative or abusive labour systems. But you don't see any of the sporting people there. It's as if they've kind of disconnected from that. That's politics, or that's something that doesn't really enter their sight. So we're working on that one. That's something I'd really like to pursue with the Rights Lab, especially this issue of trafficking in and through football, of which there's quite a bit. But again, it's like you were saying earlier, how do we find the research that will give us some figures? We need to know roughly how many we're talking. We need to know what the scale of the problem is. Obviously, if it's only a few, it's really important that we get to grips with it.
But it'd be good to know that answer.
But it'd be good to know that, because that would have required a different solution.
Yeah, in the absence of knowing it. And also the intersectionality is interesting to me. So if you take a Premiership football club, you think there's material supply of, the strip, the shirts, and everything else, right? So how are those produced? We're back to fashion. The footballs themselves, where does the leather come from? How are those footballs put together? Etc. What's been the journey of that football to the stadium being used in that game? That's an interesting question. Then there's the people aspect. So, how are people recruited to play? Where do they come from? And we know that there's an international recruitment effort, but we only ever see the stars. So how many people were recruited that never ever made it, right? And what happened to them? And then the final thing, I think, is around the construction of large stadia for big international sporting events themselves. So we know that in certain parts of the world, the labour, and then we're back into construction, right? But still, nevertheless, it's connected to sport in that sense, because you have a grand event, whether it's Olympics, whether it's World Championships, whether it's something big, where a stadium is needed, needs to be built quickly. There's a great vision, and this is going to transform a local area, etc. But also, the workers are shipped in either from abroad or domestically. And then, what are the conditions of the people that are doing that work?
We know that a number died during the Russian World Cup. We know that the number of fatalities in Qatar probably won't ever be known exactly, but it will probably run into the thousands rather than the hundreds. And so there's all of that. There's also, any big club in the top 6 of the Premier League also has a shop. So yes, the kit, because some of them will say, oh, well, the kit's all right because we get that from Adidas or Puma or Nike or whatever. Yeah, well, okay, they've each had their own problems in this area. But in the shops, you'll find, I don't know, like pens and mugs and photograph frames and ties and all of these bits and pieces. Plus, the kit is an interesting one because although the main part of it may be made in one factory, the badges will be put on somewhere else. So, and they may not be made in the same place as the shorts. So again, it's like, how do you keep track of, and this sort of hyper-distributed supply chains is really, really difficult, and they've got to face up to that.
But for public awareness raising, I think you have a window of opportunity here,
yeah, sure.
if I may say so, because these are absolute recognized brands that absolutely filter their way into everybody's home. Anybody that has a couple of kids and or whatever is a football fan. I myself am not a huge football fan, but I know enough to see how incredibly pervasive it is within just UK society, let alone the European Championship and World Cup Championships. So there's actually a ready audience that maybe is a little uncomfortable with the concept, but there might be creative ways to influence policymaking in this area. Exactly. So it sounds like some really exciting work for the future. I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us on this episode of The Rights Track. I've learned a lot about the interconnectedness between fashion, supply chain, sport, and all the great work that you're doing. So for now, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Todd.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more about our podcast at www.rightstrack.org. Funding for this series comes from the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab project, home to the world's leading contemporary modern slavery experts and the first large-scale research platform for ending modern slavery.